BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the special weekend presentation of BlackBoxOnlineRadio. On the weekends, I've been doing a regular segment about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996, and I finally got around to watching the Suburban Nightmare series that is available on Tubi, T-U-B-I. I mean, I call it T-U-B-I because it was a streaming service that is free, but it debuted several years ago, and no one was talking about it, but all of their content was so easily available, I wasn't quite sure how to pronounce it, so I called it T-U-B-I. And it's not the first time I've reviewed one of the documentaries from Tubi in their original series. I did one response to Fresh Meat, the documentary they did about Jeffrey Dahmer, and they also have episodes in their new Suburban Nightmare series, which has come out over the past couple years about the Menendez brothers and Chris Watts. But recently they released an episode about JonBenet Ramsey, a documentary that's about 90 minutes long, about an hour and a half, and I was just watching that one because on the weekends I was doing a book discussion on Stephen Singular's Presumed Guilty, which talks about the death of JonBenet and a particular theory that there was a sex ring in Colorado that might have connections to her death. And I wanted to take a break from that one and respond to this particular documentary because it was just something new and different, and I'm also very curious what these presenters would have to say. And if you would like to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, whether it's talking about JonBenet Ramsey or the Zodiac Killer, whatever subject may come out on Fridays for the Anything Goes Friday segment, I invite you to like and subscribe to this channel. And there are a bunch of links in the description box that you can look at on ways to support the show. But JonBenet Ramsey was murdered in 1996, just after Christmas Day, on December 26th, most likely at the time of the murder. Some people think that it happened on Christmas night before midnight, but she was only 6 years old at the time. She was found in the basement of her Boulder, Colorado home with an 8.5-inch crack in her skull. Duct tape was placed over her mouth, and she had also been strangled with something that has been called the garrote, where it's more intricate than a string or a rope or a piece of parachute cord. It was tied to a piece of wood with some type of reasonably advanced knotting or lashing, and they definitely think that the person who tied the garrote had some familiarity with knots. JonBenet was also restrained on her wrists. She had restraints on her wrists that had been tied over her sweater, which suggested that she had been unconscious at the time that she had been tied up. And I was watching this documentary about JonBenet Ramsey, and again, it's called Suburban Nightmare, JonBenet Ramsey, available on Tubi for free. And they took a very clear stance that an intruder murdered JonBenet Ramsey, that she was not killed by one of her family members, or at the very least, she was not killed by the 3 family members that were living in the house: her father, John Ramsey, her mother, Patsy Ramsey, and her brother, Burke Ramsey. And they looked at a lot of the investigative work that had been done by a detective named Lou Smith. And I think that I felt so conflicted watching this, because in my episodes on JonBenet Ramsey here on this channel, I have said very clearly that I had believed from the beginning that an intruder had been responsible for her death. And I think that that's somewhat of an unpopular opinion online. Other people are just looking at that as like a bland answer that isn't looking at all of the more sensational theories out there, or they just really want to vilify a certain member of the family in the court of public opinion. However, I was conflicted because this documentary was taking the stance that an intruder murdered JonBenet, yet because I've been doing the book discussion and I've been talking about other theories about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey for quite some time now, I was exposed to so many of the points that I think they misinterpreted or misrepresented, or just my skeptical sense really kicked in. And the first one is they tried to present the idea that Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's brother, was her killer as some type of fringe theory online, or just that there are only a few people here and there who think that Burke Ramsey was responsible for the death of his sister back in 1996. And that is so far from the truth. I mean, there are countless people who think that Burke was responsible for this. It's widely discussed as perhaps one of even the most widely discussed theories involving the death of JonBenet Ramsey, and he has also been the subject of a documentary that was put out by CBS. That's one of the most famous ones because Burke Ramsey sued them for $750 million. And because I've been doing the book discussion on Presumed Guilty by Stephen Singular, I've been reading other articles and watching other clips on YouTube, and they talked about how, okay, he sued them because he was the subject of a documentary about a murder that he was never charged with, and that documentary took its own persuasive stance by saying that they thought Burke was responsible for her death. And he was trying to say that, he's never been charged with a crime, his reputation has been destroyed, but the only way that he could actually claim the $750 million is if he could prove that they had some type of malicious intent, and most likely that episode did not. And there are clips all about this on YouTube. Instead, they were just presenting a theory or hypothesis about something that could have possibly happened, and the presenters of that one were probably not trying to destroy his reputation, but rather truly examine the possibilities. And I think that a lot of that info that had already been shared to the general public was left out of Suburban Nightmare, available on Tubi. Number one, they stated that they thought it was really unlikely that a 9-year-old child could be strong enough to strike a 6-year-old girl in the head and shatter her skull, or even leave the 8.5-inch crack in the skull going all the way back to the occipital bone. Again, pieces of JonBenet's skull were shattered. The entirety of her skull was not shattered. I need to be very careful with my words. But the CBS documentary showed that was extremely possible. Number two, they also kept an open mind about the possibility that JonBenet had been attacked with a stun gun. And the CBS documentary pointed out very clearly that if she had been attacked with a stun gun, or a stun gun had been used on JonBenet Ramsey, there would have been large sections of pink coloration on her body, and those marks were not present. That's why some people think that Burke Ramsey struck his sister in the head with a blunt object, maybe a flashlight, and then he picked up a piece of his toy train track set and stabbed her with it just to see if she would be responsive. I was tempted to use the word revive her, but some people think that maybe just responsive would be a better word than reviving. He wanted to see if he could wake her up or get her out of the state that she was in. But the point that I always go back to with this is JonBenet Ramsey died from strangulation. She did not die from the head wound. And this is something that people do not want to talk about. They want to simply point that the family murdered JonBenet and they covered up her crime by strangling her. And I'm just so shocked by this. I mean, I'm flabbergasted. I'm really using that word for the sole reason that they didn't make sure that she was dead. Like, either John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, or Burke Ramsey would have struck her in the head and then they didn't make sure that she was still alive, and they covered up her death by strangling her to death. I thought that always made absolutely no sense, and I've never heard that in any place other than Black Box Online Radio, but that is something that I have concerns about. And as I said, I've always thought that an intruder murdered JonBenet. I just thought that Suburban Nightmare was exploring the theory in somewhat of an incorrect, inappropriate, and far out way. That that their explanations about why they thought an intruder was responsible for the case were not very strong at best. And also, they featured a lot of discussions from John Ramsay in this documentary Suburban Nightmare, available on Tubi, where he is just simply saying, no, no, nobody did it. My family did. Oh, did you murder your daughter? No. Did Patsy Ramsey murder her? No. Did Burke murder her? No. And, well, what exactly would somebody say to that? I mean, people don't regularly confess to murder. Now, the points that this persuasive documentary tried to share with the viewers are: number one, there were 2 samples of DNA found on JonBenet Ramsey's long johns as well as on her leg that came from an unidentified male that was not a member of the family, evidence of an intruder. And they also wanted to point out that duct tape was not regularly kept in the Ramsay household, and again, JonBenet Ramsey had duct tape over her mouth when she was found dead. And the all the evidence that people like to say that favors the Ramsey's guilt is that the garrote was made from a paintbrush that belonged to Patsy Ramsey. The ransom note that was found after JonBenet Ramsey was left behind, the one that says, "We're a small foreign faction who is holding your daughter, and we will behead her if you don't give us $118,000." That one, the 2.5-page ransom note, that was written on the notepad from Ramsey's house. That was written with a marker or felt tip pen from the Ramsey's own supplies. So all of these things are found within the house. And one of you guys in the comments section even said flat out, looking at the facts, there are only 3 people who have been conclusively identified at home at the time when JonBenet should have been murdered: John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey. So one of the family members is placed at the scene of the crime. And I am forced to admit that. And I really noticed that that type of thinking was not present in the Suburban Nightmare documentary. Or just, there's just always this explanation that there's this imaginary person X who committed the crime, but they leave out the fact that the Ramseys are present. They also leave out the fact that there's the whole story about JonBenet ingesting pineapple before she was murdered, and that suggested some type of familial behavior or interacting with her family. And I mean, I think that their presentation also lacked a few key things, such as Patsy Ramsey did not change her clothes and did not take off her makeup the night before she learned that her daughter was found murdered. I mean, they also have John Ramsey finding the body before law enforcement does. All kinds of things, all kinds of suspicious behaviors that should be discussed in relation to somebody's murder were not present, and it's a little bit misleading. But on the other hand, I mean, the stuff about DNA, I think, is going to be much more conclusive. And I also think that they showed a very convincing piece of evidence that I do stand by, that I do genuinely agree with. I know I've been saying a lot of critical things, but I genuinely agree with the points when they showed the investigator Lou Smith entering the household. And they said that he was in his early 70s at the time, but he showed how easy it would have been for an intruder to break into the house. And what Lou Smith shared, which was then reinterpreted by the Suburban Nightmare documentary, was an intruder could have broken into the Ramsey home and have been waiting there the whole time. They were out at a Christmas party, they came home late at night, JonBenet's already asleep, and this person or group of people completely knew that they were going to target JonBenet Ramsey. It was a calculated crime. And another point that was left out that I've never heard in any other source but my own observation is the ransom note could have been a diversion, that the person knew that they were murdering JonBenet Ramsey. They knew that they knew the exact intent of their actions. It wasn't just purely a sexual assault. It wasn't purely an attack on her. It wasn't purely a molestation. It was a murder that had been planned. And the ransom note was written to be a distraction, to make sure that even if somebody woke up in the middle of the night and found it, that person would be hours away by the time anybody called the police and the police would arrive. A diversion, a distraction, something to just keep people busy until the intruder, or intruders plural, could get out of the house. So I think that that part of the episode was somewhat reasonable. The whole thing about how an intruder had the opportunities and easy capabilities of breaking into the house, as well as trying to just adding a few of my own observations. But again, they just made it seem like it was impossible that a member of the Ramsay household murdered JonBenet. And even as somebody who thinks that an intruder did it, I will accept the result no matter what. This is the true crime world, where it's about the facts, it's about the truth, and a lot of us are following these cases because we genuinely want answers. We're not playing the game of the chase is more fun than the catch. No, absolutely not. People want to know the truth, and other people are trying to figure this out. They want to try and solve the equation, and if it turns out that the forensics point toward a member of the Ramsay family, and there's some type of DNA breakthrough, or there's some type of physical evidence that has been discovered that points toward the Ramsays, I would say, yes, indeed. That's the truth. I was wrong. But I also don't think that fudging the facts and making it look like that possibility is just that impossible is a good idea either. Like, no, there's absolutely no possible way that the Ramsays murder their daughter, or just saying something to the effect of, oh, well, Burke Ramsay was never a serious suspect. The majority of people on the internet probably think that Burke Ramsay murdered his sister, and no matter what, it has been widely discussed. I can't present you a percentage or something, but widely discussed. He is one of the most frequently discussed suspects in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. CBS did an entire documentary about him for a reason. They weren't pulling that stuff out of thin air. Instead, there were different theories that people go with, and they wanted to explore one of them. And I found that certain things were just left out of this suburban nightmare presentation. But on the other hand, there are different ways of presenting information, and you can go back to essay writing workshops. I know that that's the most boring way to talk about this, but there is the descriptive essay, which just simply states points and facts, different pieces of information. And then there's the persuasive essay, which is trying to argue a point. It's trying to convince the reader, listener, or watcher, viewer of a particular issue. And Suburban Nightmare was something that really tried to persuade everybody that this was an intruder. They're trying to say that the forensics point toward an intruder murdering JonBenet. But some of the other things that are very technical about this documentary that I wanted to save toward the end is that one of the people who was featured in this show simply had the title card former Boulder resident. I mean, like, I was like, why on earth is she there? I mean, I've been critical of other true crime documentaries for featuring freelance journalists because they're just, well, that's just Joe Schmo who decided to read a lot about the case. But former Boulder resident. What, somebody was living in Boulder, Colorado years ago? I mean, can I be in the documentary? Former American resident. Oh shit, no, I can't. Former American. No, no, I'm still American. I might be a West Virginian, but that's still part of America. Patsy Ramsey was a West Virginian too, and even though she may have tarnished the state name a little bit, but former Boulder resident, that is not a very big credential, and I totally get why they had her there. She wanted to talk about responding to the news coverage at the time, and what was it like growing up, and what were people saying about JonBenet as a former Boulder resident. But that's not the most credible source. That's not the most scholarly source, and it's definitely not the most investigative reporting, because the general public doesn't get the narrative right all the time. And just like this goes back to something that Jon Stewart said, like, well, what are you doing? You're getting your news from the guy in the bathroom now? That's more or less what it is when you just bring on a former resident. And I want to be a current American resident talking about JonBenet Ramsey. I mean, that should have some weight as well, right? I mean, well, where's my episode on Tubi? Where's your episode on Tubi? You can be an international resident no matter what country you're coming from. And I think you guys get the point that that's not the most convincing source material. But those are very technical aspects about the documentary Suburban Nightmare. And what I think is much more important is to focus on the fact that they took a very strong stance, and perhaps they glorify the investigative work of Lou Smith a little bit too much, because I have called him in at least one particular falsehood, and that is when he talked about how JonBenet would not have died from the head wound if it hadn't been for the strangulation. And if you go back to some of my older episodes, did Michael Helgoth murder JonBenet Ramsey? Did Burke Ramsey murder his sister JonBenet Ramsey? Available here on Black Box Online Radio. I discussed the investigative work of Lou Smith and show how that some of the things that he said are in direct contradiction to the medical examiner, and he should have known better. And some people say that he was just a shill for the Ramsays, or maybe shill isn't the best word. He was someone who was on the side of the Ramsays and misrepresenting information. But Lou Smith has passed away, and his granddaughters are carrying on his legacy. And I have to go back to a statement that they made on their podcast by saying, if you think that a member of the Ramsay household murdered JonBenet, then it's just somebody gave JonBenet a ding on the head that was too hard, and they made up a silly story to cover it up. And that's all it is. That's all it is. And in every fiber of my being, no film critiques, no criticisms, no analysis of someone else's documentary, in every fiber of my being, I don't think that's what happened. I don't think that Burke Ramsey hit his sister in the head with a flashlight and John Ramsey strangled her to death to cover it up. Because, number one, they didn't know that she was dead at the time, and I think what would have been much more likely is they would have tried to revive her or resuscitate her, and how about bringing her to a hospital or something to that effect? I mean, again, the strangulation is what led to the death of JonBenet. Number two, I also think that it's a very far-fetched plan about writing a ransom note to just make it look like an abductor had taken JonBenet, like Patsy Ramsey writing this to cover up for someone else in the family, or her own activities involving JonBenet's death. I mean, that's just even a little bit silly. We are a small foreign faction. I mean, just like this is all coming from Patsy Ramsey's imagination. Instead, that sounds like the writing of somebody who is rather twisted and demented, and, as I said, buying time so they can get out of the house. And, as well, it was completely possible that someone could have broken into the home. Also, the DNA evidence does not seem to match any particular individual of the Ramsey household. And keep in mind, the authorities always know more than what they're leading on. Because there are things such as side palm print testing, like writer's palm. When the side of your palm print presses against a piece of paper, they can extract that the same way they can look at a fingerprint. They can test for side palm prints the way they can test for fingerprints. We talk about this in the Zodiac Killer mystery all the time. They should be able to tell that, okay, either this person wrote the ransom note or they did not, or this person was, maybe they were wearing gloves or they did not. That those types of questions can be answered. And I think that a lot of the info that has been kept from the general public, and the authorities know a lot more than they're choosing to share with us in the public. But I think I can't say much more than that because that would require a lot of guesswork. But what do you think? I know that this episode was a giant twisted rambling mess, but I'm coming at this from the standpoint of someone who does believe that an intruder murdered JonBenet, taking a strong stance. I just didn't really agree with the reasons that were put forward by Suburban Nightmare, and I thought that they misrepresented other people's theories, and they tried to downplay and um, share an incorrect viewpoint on the subject. But what do you think? You put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.